Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Jessie Gabriel, the founder and CEO of All Places. There are so many talks out there around board diversity, and we wanted to bring something a little bit different to that conversation. So in part one, which I think some of you attended, we talked about what you do once you achieve board diversity. And now we're kind of taking a few steps back to talk about different ways to get to that diversity you're seeking and how different stakeholders play a role in that. So today we're focusing specifically on investors and how they can drive that diversity. This program, like so many, was a collaborative effort between three organizations. One, the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network at the NYU School of Law. They focus on remedying gender inequities, which sounds great, through putting on programs like this, having these important conversations, leadership training. And I specifically want to thank Abby Seidner and Claire Whitman, who worked really hard to put this all together. The next organization is the Beyond Me Too Working Group on Corporate Governance, Compliance, and Risk. This is an organization that arose out of the Me Too movement, a group primarily of lawyers talking about how you drive change through corporate governance, so at that corporate level. And the third organization is my firm, All Places, which is a business and legal strategy firm that supports female asset managers and entrepreneurs. So I'm going to talk briefly about logistics. For all you lawyers, there will be CLE credit, and I'm going to go ahead and read this so I don't miss any of the details. The credit is both transitional and non-transitional. Not sure what that means. Hopefully some of you do. It is appropriate for experienced and newly admitted attorneys. To get the CLE credit today, you need to make sure, like with all CLE, right, you need to write down those verification codes. And then you'll get an email after the program where you fill out your affirmation with the codes. For everyone, we really want you to submit questions. So I think we've all been on so many of these. They're always more interesting for the panel and for the audience when we get your engagement and we know specifically what you want to talk about. So please use that Q&A box. For anyone who wants closed captioning, that is available. I believe there's just a closed captioning button that you can click on. So the panel. First, Kelly Williams will be moderating. I think for me and probably many of you, when you think about someone who has really highlighted the issue of gender inequity in asset management, the first person you think of is probably Kelly. She's done a million things, but one of them was she founded PE Win. She serves on multiple public company boards. She's an experienced, very successful investor. And when we put together what was our dream panel, which you're going to see in front of you, Kelly was our dream moderator. So Kelly Williams. Okay, Solange Fernandez-Brooks. Solange is the CEO of the New America Alliance. The NAA is an organization focused on advocating for the diverse asset manager community with a particular focus in their roots with the Latino community. And I think very highly of the NAA. I'm completely biased. But Solange also, before coming to the NAA, she was a portfolio manager at CalSTRS. She's an Air Force veteran, just incredible. And it's hard to think of somebody who will have more insight into the topic we're addressing today than Solange. Erica Degnan Minahan is the founder and managing partner of Rain Ventures. They are a seed stage venture firm that, she just waved, but I think I'm the only one who can see her. They're a seed stage venture firm focused in the consumer tech and software startups, specifically companies founded by underrepresented individuals. She also founded 1000 Angels and a bunch of other things. I think the great thing that Erica is going to bring to this conversation is talking about working with companies at the beginning to create a diverse and inclusive culture, which is going to be a nice balance to the rest of the conversation, which will be about how companies need to back into it when they didn't start with that diverse culture. And finally, Pamela Gibbs. Pam is the director of the SEC's Office of Minority and Women Inclusion. She's been a lifelong public servant, CFTC, Department of Labor. Probably very few of you knew that the SEC even had this office. So Pam is going to educate all of us on what they're doing and what the SEC sees as its role in this conversation. So, disclaimer, the views expressed by all of the panelists are their personal individual views and do not represent the views of their respective organizations. And with that, I'm going to become an audience member and turn this over to Kelly.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm so excited to be with you all. The other disclaimer I'm going to give is that if you hear sawing and hammering in the background, my neighbor is doing construction, so please don't hold it against me. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here. As many people know who've seen me speak before, my armor in these Zoom calls is my big dark glasses and red lipstick. So if that's my Zoom hack that I'm sharing at the beginning of this, I'm thrilled to be here with these incredible women who are also my friends to have this really important discussion. And so we're talking about diversity in companies and corporations and the role that investors can play in driving that diversity. But I thought in order to ground the discussion, we might dial back a little bit. And I'm speaking in part from my experience as the chair of the Nominating and Governance Committee of a public company, where I regularly speak to our investors, and the topics of diversity do come up. But I thought it might be helpful for everyone if we actually started by talking about the motivations and what's going on from a dynamic standpoint within the investor community. And I think maybe to take an example, one of the biggest institutional investor blocks in both public and private investing are pension plans, both public and private. And so I thought it might be helpful, given that Solange has this extraordinary experience from her time at CalSTRS, to talk a little bit about what motivates an investor, and like CalSTRS, doesn't have to be CalSTRS, but like a CalSTRS or CalPERS or New York Common, what motivates them to focus on diversity and start having conversations with either their managers or with companies that they invest in.
Thank you, Kelly. Motivation is interesting, but the motivation for all pension plans is their constituents, is providing that return to their constituents, making sure the teachers who work, 20, 30 years have a good retirement, have the security that a retirement provides. Having said that, you have to dig a little deeper and take a look at what the constituents are like, the composition of the constituents. So for example, at CalSTRS, something like, 75 to 80% of the teachers are women. Not only women, well-educated women, progressive women, women who have a classroom of very diverse classroom with kids of just about every ethnicity and race and gender and viewpoints, and they love that environment. They realize the richness that represents, and they carry that on to organizations like CalSTRS, and they want to make sure that when you look at this, when you're looking for this return, you vet every single opportunity that you have. And let's face it, if you're not vetting women and diverse firms, you are leaving money on the table. And that is ridiculous. So they, the teachers, but not only the teachers, there's a lot of, firefighters and policemen and some folks that as a group you might consider very conservative, but when it comes to actually wanting their money to do well, they also want to do good. And that is permeating, I think, most of the pension plans. And the people that make the investments realize that, and that want to go ahead and make adjustments as they come fit. But the first thing is returns. I mean, you have to remember that it's returns. But you have, you have a great big change that has happened within, the past 10 years or so. Now, I think that most people can go to large pension plans and look for a report that that denotes that says what they're doing in just about every aspect of investments. And diversity and inclusion is one of those components. And it was a component before, a couple of years ago. People were looking to making sure that it wasn't just something that you do. It's not like a one and done type of thing, but it's something that that the organization, that the businesses that they invested commit to transparency and diversity as a form of business, and that it permeates the organization.
Right. Well, you make such a good point, Solange. I always say to people, look no further than the cover of Forbes from 2 years ago when Robert Smith appeared on the Fortune 500, the billionaires issue. And I say, look, he's a private equity guy, and he got to be a billionaire because he's good at what he does. So you only make money in private equity if your returns are good. So I think that, to your point of, if you're not looking at everybody, you're not doing your job. So I think it was important for everybody to understand what are the dynamics going on behind the scenes. In many cases, whether you're a mutual fund, whether you're a public pension plan, a foundation, or an endowment, it's often the board of that institution that is putting the spotlight on the need to make sure that the companies in which the institution is investing are looking at diversity. So I want to turn to Erica, and because Erica, you're an early stage investor, you are there like right at the the nascent point in a company's life. What are things that companies can do as they're forming to make sure that they are taking advantage of the diverse population that they can use to build their company?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. That's such a great question. One of the reasons, that we were so excited to build Rain Ventures and to raise our fund was because there are so few female GPs and GPs of color in the market who are actually occupying these board seats and getting the opportunity to work really closely with companies to track this important information and to really sort of bring it more to their attention on a regular basis as the company grows. So I've been an early stage investor for the last 15 years, but without a fund, you don't have the opportunity to be as closely involved with the companies and to take that all important board seat that actually gives you, the ability to more closely guide founders, to assist with recruiting into, high level roles that folks of color would love to have the opportunity to apply for, but some founders don't necessarily have the social and academic networks, within women or people of color that gives them access to these really great talent pools. So for us, being able to have a fund to lead rounds and to actually take a board seat has been really beneficial to our portfolio companies to make sure that they're building in ways that end up with, diversity sort of embedded into the business. Even in situations where we're acting as a co-investor, and so we don't necessarily occupy that board seat, we're also able to, more extensively work with them to understand markets that they might be overlooking and how to think thoughtfully about whether it's addressing their female customer or, addressing, certain communities of ethnic diversity that they might have just completely overlooked. And I, think that it's so important to be sensitive as well to the fact that we live in such a segregated society. When we have, a white female founder, she's probably not been exposed to a lot of the other communities that could be her customers. So when we're working with her as an investor, we can help give her a heads up to like, oh, what about this group of people, that group of people. Maybe you should have some people on your team that understand, how to serve those communities as clients as well. So, everything sort of has to happen one step at a time. But I think that as we have more early stage firms with GPs that are more, are helping to diversify the pool of investor capital, we're going to see a real impact on how companies are built, on an appreciation for treating women with, equal opportunity and respect in the workplace from the beginning, and also really thinking about how diversity can help their companies grow more efficiently.
So I often get asked by my male friends, either who are, they're investment managers, they're asset managers, or they're starting a company. And it's, two guys who went to business school together, two guys who worked at Goldman together. And they say, look, how do we make our company female friendly? And I say, first thing you should do is have a parental leave policy, even before you have a single woman join you. Because if you wait till after the women join, they're going to know that you never anticipated them being part of the company. So that's why I think it's essential. It's so great to have you there. Maybe not to ask you to reveal anything, but I would imagine when you're co-investing with some of the bros, they don't necessarily think of some of these things. I mean, is it an awkward conversation to talk to your co-investors, especially if you're not the lead? To help heighten their sensitivity about some of these opportunities? Because clearly you're doing it just because you want the company to be more successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of these conversations have to be handled very delicately. But what we think is very important is, within our firm, we're actually sort of tracking within our portfolio companies their metrics of diversity around gender inclusion and, ethnic diversity inclusion as well. So just the very fact that we're actually, taking note of it and asking them to kind of report and to be thoughtful as to how they're building and reaching out to folks, really just makes them more aware, right? So, I think that realistically, it's not necessarily that they don't want to build companies from the beginning with diversity, but that it really hasn't crossed their mind. And it's a lot of extra work to try and go outside of your own networks in order to, recruit people who could help you achieve that goal. So we work very closely with these companies using our networks, and leveraging, sort of our relationships to help them make sure that they can bring those folks in. But certainly, I will say that the truth is that a lot of our, co-investment firms that are traditional, bros, as you say, they also have not really considered these goals at all. So, we're not telling them it has to be a priority for them, but it's certainly a priority for us, and something, that we are very explicit with the companies on from the very beginning. So, we have actually seen change happen within our companies by being able to sort of actively take this role and to work with companies to make sure that they're, stepping back, taking a look, and being really inclusive in their approach.
Great. Well, I always point to Uber as a great example of how much value can be destroyed if you don't build this into the culture. So
it's a huge risk. And the other thing too, I think that's kind of interesting, we had an example of, a company that we were working with, and, we weren't not necessarily the lead investor that's looking at, serving the female market and bringing on, female management team. And it's really, they felt really lucky to have us, involved as an investor advisor, because similarly, sometimes when, it's a male founder, male lead investor, they also can feel a little uncertain as to how to even navigate all this Me Too stuff. And, how do they bring on the right woman CEO? And, maybe it's not working out, how do they kind of address these challenges? So having that diversity at the investor level, I think makes them feel like they have a better perspective and support around making decisions that are based on, equity, and not necessarily, being scared to deliver hard news.
Very
Yeah.
good point. Well, so Pam, I always say what gets measured gets done. And so the SEC certainly has a role in monitoring, but also, I guess, encouraging as companies are formed, both private and public companies. I'm fascinated to hear more about what you're doing at the SEC and specifically what your office is responsible for.
Okay, so I think in many ways, the SEC has been a leader in terms of sort of thinking about diversity and applying diversity standards to the people that we regulate and oversee, the publicly traded corporations. So a lot of times diversity and inclusions come out of crisis. We focus on it because it's crisis. So in 2008, there was a financial crisis. Many banks and companies failed, and as a result of the Dodd-Frank Act, the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion was mandated in the Dodd-Frank Act for it was 21 offices that were to be established in the financial regulatory agencies and in the Federal Reserve banks. And that basically it was under the premise that many of the people that lost their jobs, small businesses, investments, were minorities and women. And so as a result of the Congressional Black and Hispanic Caucus, they were able to insert a provision in Dodd-Frank, Section 342, that established these offices. And so I came over in 2012 as the inaugural director for the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion at the SEC. And unbeknownst to me, earlier in 2008, 2009, the SEC had already started to look at diversity in the disclosure space, the proxy disclosure place, asking publicly traded corporations to disclose what role diversity played in their board selection. And so my office, though, so when I arrived at the SEC, it talks about, so primarily a big piece of my job is business diversity, increasing utilization of minority and women-owned businesses, workforce diversity. But a piece of my function is developing diversity standards for our regulated entities. And so it's often confusing to some what that means. Who, Pam, are your regulated entities? Are they the publicly traded corporations? Who are your entities? And so no, while we regulate the disclosure statements, our regulating entities are your broker dealers, investment advisors. I think it's like 25,000 entities that we oversee, mostly small broker dealers and investment advisors. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about, and then so my role in as it relates to our regulated entities, we really are pushing people to be transparent, to disclose the information as it relates to their diversity efforts and the practices that they have in place. And so as a result, my office joined with 5 other financial regulatory agencies in 2015 to propose a joint policy where we wanted to collect information from our regulating entities. And the double-edged sword. So while it's extremely positive that we were collecting this information, the downside of it is that the provision didn't provide for any enforcement authority. So it's completely voluntary. So the SEC has been collecting data from our entities around their diversity best practices for since 2018. And while the response rate has been relatively small, the people that do respond reflects a big chunk of the industry. And so that's one piece of what we do, is via my office in our regulating entities, collecting the diversity information around leading practices from our entities where they voluntarily disclose. And I look at that information in aggregate. And then there's other pieces of the SEC, because remember, we protect the investor. We are the investor's advocate. So there are other components of the SEC that also look at diversity, and particularly in the disclosure process, and much of that is underway now.
Well, I love that you put a point on that, which is the SEC's job is to protect the investor. Obviously, the board's job is to represent the shareholders. And to reflect, the best interest of the shareholders. And so the idea that anyone has that diversity somehow you're sacrificing return, or, you're not doing your fiduciary duty is just, I think all of us would agree, it's kind of crazy. What, if you were to articulate a goal, like what you would say looks like success in terms of gathering this information and having an impact, what would you say? What would be your opinion on that?
Well, in my opinion is that, so when I came to the SEC, basically my office was a startup office. It had never existed at the SEC. Diversity had been scattered in the organization, mostly coming out of human capital. And I would say that now, after being at the agency for a little over 9 years, we're at the sustainability point. And so I think when I think about the role of protecting the investor, I think that that's what every investor wants too. They want us to protect them and address the issues that matter. And as begrudgingly as it is, diversity matters to most people now. And that's the change. That's how we have to pivot as a country. I see the SEC pivoting to embrace it as a mission imperative. For many years at the SEC, it was hard to get people to think about diversity beyond workforce and demographics about workforce. But, under former Chairman Clayton and under our current chair, Gary Gensler, they understand now that investors are diverse. That investors, so we have to, as an agency, embrace the concept of diversity, because we have to stand ready to include those viewpoints in our regulatory schematic and how we develop disclosures around corporate board diversity, ESG, any creditor investor, that everything that we do, we have to assume that they are diverse investors that we are protecting. And so I think that we're pivoting a little bit. I heard this analogy the other day that it's like the Nike swoosh, and that's the way I see the SEC. We're swooshing now up in a way that diversity is really becoming a central component of how we think about protecting the investor.
Well, I love that. I don't know that anyone would have thought of the SEC as swooshing, but I love that. I love that. And so, yeah, and I completely agree with you. I mean, my perspective is that, diversity is not a human capital thing. You achieve it through human capital, right? But diversity is actually a competitive advantage. Erica articulated that really well. I'd love to hear, and Solange, given the work that you're doing with NAA, you've got a good perspective on this. Like, who do you think is doing a good job at this? I mean, I think those of us who work with public companies and are on, public company boards know, everybody waits to see Larry Fink's letter from BlackRock come out and articulate, look, these are the things we're going to be focused on. And guess what, guys, if you're not doing a good job on diversity, we're not going to vote for your non-gov chair. There's a lot of, when you have the imprimatur of somebody like BlackRock and they're focused on this, it makes a difference. And I think we all know when investors start asking the questions, that's when asset managers start getting their act together and have an answer. But, Solange, I'd love your perspective on who do you think is doing a good job on this and something other investors could learn from.
Two names popped up when you asked me that, and they're very different. But the first one is Chicago Teachers. I have to say that Chicago Teachers, it's a small fund, but about 46 to 47% of their investments is managed by women and people of color. And when I stated that statistic to somebody, they said, well, yeah, but Illinois has, has some laws that make them do that. No, they don't. They have an aspirational goal of 20%. These folks went the extra mile. Now they're at 47%. And I asked the CIO and I asked the staff, how did you achieve that? And what they said is that they were open to new ideas and to new investments. And they organize their business so they can listen to new opportunities that are out there. That's tremendous. Even for a small fund, it is tremendous. That's one. So I think that individually, institutional investors can find their own way. The second is more of a general group. And this is, it surprised the heck out of me, but it's advisors to institutional investors. And I won't name names, but I've had conversations with various of them, advisors since I've been in this position. And I received a call from one of them, fairly large advisor, that is changing the way they are vetting their funds. And they're looking at diversity and inclusion to be a mindset that permeates the entire organization. In other words, they just don't want to say, okay, this fund has 3 partners that are diverse, they have 2 females and they're okay. No, they're looking into the way they're conducting business. So we had a very good discussion about that. And, you know, transparency, as Pamela mentioned, was key. Transparency in reporting diversity statistics, transparency in letting people know, you know, what the type of job they're doing. And they're basically going to, you know, their best practices. They're looking at, you know, my input was you should ensure that a firm ties pay and promotions to their diversity goals. I bet you it goes up like that. If you tie pay and promotion, you want to make sure that you recruit people who don't look like you. You know, that's just a very simple thing to do, but I think it will, you know, you have to commit to pay equity. You know, I can't believe that at 2021, we're talking about pay equity, but you have to commit with that. And, you know, they had a list of various, you know, key points that they wanted to go ahead and include. And I thought, wow, you know, this is, and I said, did this come from the pension plans that you work for? And they said, no, this came from a group of us getting together and finding out how do we advance this, you know, goal further. How do we ensure that we're not just doing a check the box? So if that is going on, if those conversations are going on in advisory firms, I think we're going to see a lot of good things coming up. Anyway, it makes me feel very hopeful.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, I think we both know that's not a statement either of us would have expected you to make even 5 years ago, because I think a lot of people saw advisors as the roadblocks because they were very much check the box.
And they were gatekeepers. I mean, that's what they call them, gatekeepers. And for these people to say, what can we do so that when we evaluate funds, we're making sure that diversity and transparency are part of their business ethos? That just completely surprised me. We have some funds within our own organization who one of their points is to ensure that the underlying companies that they invest in have at least 2 to 3 diverse individuals and women. And this is something that they do in their own portfolio. You know, it might seem kind of small, but if you think if all private equity firms would do that, it would be incredible. Incredible. So there's little things happening here and there. So it makes everybody, you know, it makes us hopeful.
Well,
Very-
you point out, and it really embedded in what you're talking about is kind of the difference and the nuance between diversity and inclusion. You know, diversity is just
Mhm.
head counting, right? How
Mhm.
many of each
Yeah.
category of people, whereas inclusion is really creating the culture that allows people to thrive and to succeed.
And in private equity, inclusion, particularly female, particularly women voices, has not been present.
No, and what
And
that what happens is when investors like you or me, historically had done diligence, we would ask the diversity question, but a lot of investors were not asking the inclusion question. And these are questions you can ask either a private company or a public company, private or public asset managers. It's really about, where does the power lie? Who's got the power to make decisions? Who's got the power to set strategy? Who's got the power to pay people? Who's got that power to hire and fire people? I remember New York City Pension actually developed a questionnaire for their managers probably 5 or 6 years ago that
Mhm.
started to drill in on these types of questions. And so, Erica, I want to ask you, because we talked a little bit about the diversity issues at the companies. How do you have the conversations with them about the inclusion piece, about the culture piece, and setting up a culture for the employees to succeed, but also for the company to succeed?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And, I wish that I wish there was just sort of a formula we could apply to everybody and get it done. But, one of the things that's so wonderful about what I do is that, everything is very bespoke and on a case by case basis, and is about building relationships and trust with, these teams that are just growing, right? So when you're going from 3 to 10 to 20, really sort of being able to sort of dig in there with the management teams and, evaluate folks, bring in new folks and, really sort of pay close attention to how the team is evolving and that there is sort of inclusion happening along the way. So, I think what we really do, as I mentioned before, is work really closely with founders to make sure that they are thinking about it, that they're expanding their reach and that we're actively partnering with them to expand reach, and also putting systems in place to just make sure that they're actually tracking the numbers, hopefully that they're starting to partner with some sort of an HR consultant or professional from the beginning to put in these sort of policies that make everybody feel comfortable and included. And, for us, a big part of, what we're doing to promote inclusion and access to power is by investing in underrepresented founders, right? So making sure that those folks who, might not necessarily, fit that standard mold, right? Like, oh, did you go to this school and did you work at this brand name firm? That they also have the ability to be recognized, to be supported, to be nurtured, and for the talents that they're bringing to the table through, a really different and unique experience to be amplified. Right. And a big part of, our partnership at Rain, I have a little bit more of, kind of the traditional banking, Columbia Business School background. My partner, has a completely different background, right? Isn't somebody who folks would have necessarily gone on, to be active in venture capital, but is able to be, so value added to these portfolio companies by bringing a truly different perspective. So we think about that a lot as we're, guiding our, company management teams to think about, how to open their minds a little bit, to take away some of the preconceived notions that they might have about who they're going to hire for various roles, and how to really think about, as we say, generating that alpha by, looking for folks who, are going to uniquely have the ability to thrive in their specific situation. One of the things that Solange mentioned too, that I think is so important about making sure that you have diversity on the cap table, is particularly the gender pay equity issue. I think that it makes such a difference to have women involved in these conversations and kind of overseeing what's going on, because one of the things I've noticed in my career, and just in life in general, is that all of us are somewhat subconsciously programmed, particularly when we see a woman, who's maybe married, to think, oh, great, I can probably pay that person less because, what does your husband do again? And it's very, very prevalent. When, I think of so many jobs I've made where, I was applying for the job and, versus maybe a man, and then they were like, oh, well, we're going to dock this, you have the offer, but the salary is reduced by 25%. I mean, it's just very, very obvious. So, being able to kind of catch those things early, work with them to understand, number one, lay the numbers out on the table, but number two, just be a little bit more open-minded in your thinking, cast a wider net. Everything's not about pattern matching and recognition and, who sort of fits these different molds. And from that perspective, we can start to offer really great opportunities to thrive to people who might otherwise be overlooked.
Yeah, that's a great point. Gosh, that's a whole nother panel. So make note that we could definitely do another panel on that. So I encourage our attendees to start thinking about your questions. Please send them through on the Q&A app here on Zoom. The final question I want to ask, and I have plenty of other questions, but the last one I want to pose is, and I'll start with you, Pam, in your experience, what would you observe is the most effective place for investors to focus the DEI conversation? Is it the C-suite? Is it the board? Is it looking at, as you say, workforce? Where do you think investors can have the most influence and therefore the most impact?
If I could say all, it would be all, because I think they all have some deficiencies that need to continue to be focused on. But I think probably at this juncture, I would start with corporate board diversity. I think that once you start to elevate diversity to your board and your CEO, it's like a catch-22 situation though. And you don't get on boards unless you have a certain specific type of experience. So it's almost like you have to focus your diversity efforts internally to that organization. But I think at this juncture where we are, particularly from the SEC standpoint in developing disclosures for companies, I think corporate, the G is very important of the ESG equation. And so I think that if we get that right, and then some other disclosures, I think it will trickle inside the organization in terms of a board asking to see the demographics of the company, to see the progress that they've made around culture and inclusion, to see the progress around pay and compensation. So I think that a starting point is probably the easiest to achieve, and that's the board diversity.
Solange or Erica, do you have a different perspective or an additional perspective on that?
I agree with what Pam is saying. However, I'm more from the investment standpoint. It has to start with the CIO. The Chief Investment Officer has a tremendous role in this. The Chief Investment Officer, she can set up a system where every single opportunity is viewed and reviewed, and things don't fall through the cracks. The Chief Investment Officer can hire people around her that have her same viewpoint of diversity and inclusion, and it can do wonders. If you have a Chief Investment Officer who is not committed to diversity and inclusion, the people right below him or her have a tremendous job where you can be, you can still get it done, but my goodness, it is a struggle. It is, you have to be relentless. So I would start with a CIO. I would start with a CIO to make sure, because I have been in situations where the CIO called the advisor and said, why didn't you review this fund and that fund and that fund? You know, it was clear as to where the CIO was coming from. I have also seen other situations where the CIO didn't want to be bothered with that. You know, diversity, okay, that's corporate governance, you know, issue, not mine. And that's, you know, that's not good. So I think if you have a good body, a good investors in the institutional investor suite, it can do wonders.
Well, you make an important point, and again, for our attendees who don't necessarily know the nuances of what goes
Oh.
on, investors, you know, as I said, we were talking earlier, it's often a board-driven conversation. The board is the one who says, look, this is important. If the investment staff who's actually implementing the investments and vetting either the companies or the managers, if they don't believe in it, if they resist it, it doesn't happen. And it's really not until, you know, they start getting asked the tough questions about why there isn't diversity and the light is sort of shined on them that this becomes a priority. So one question from our audience that I want to talk about is, you know, we've talked a lot about gender diversity, we've talked about ethnic diversity, we've mentioned other types of, you know, sexual orientation or differently abled, and that's something I think that companies and managers focus on. The difference is those are typically self-reported. It's not something that that is as necessarily can be necessarily as apparent. And so, you know, how do you all think in terms of the conversations around diversity? How do those groups get incorporated? Solange, I'd love, you know, given that NAA has a broad mandate, I'd love to hear, you know, does that conversation come up in the context of orientation?
Yes, I mean, I will be very Latinos, okay, to begin with, Hispanics. We come in all races. We come in all shades of those races. We come in, you know, everything. The person right next to you might be Latino and you don't know it, or Latina. And, you know, having to confirm that somebody is Latino. I mean, I've actually written letters because somebody has blue eyes and blonde hair and they don't believe him or her is insane. The same reason as somebody said, no, this person is African-American, he's not Latino. And I go, yes, he is as Latino as I am. I mean, that is, and because of that, a lot of Latinos go unnoticed completely. It is seen that we don't have a problem because people don't see us. And that is, it's very, very sad. I think that organizations like NAA, and not only for Latinos, you know, you have AIM for Asian Americans, you know, organizations like this, we try to go ahead and bring up the issue and the challenges that some of our people in our groups have. And we make it obvious. We make it, it's like, hey, you know what, this is great, but perhaps you should look at this group or that group, or maybe I have some people that I can recommend, and you talk about it. I mean, that's the only way that I can see that works, is that you just come out and talk about, even in areas where people feel uncomfortable, you know, people might feel uncomfortable saying, you know, and I tell this story to make sure that everybody knows. We have a board member in our NAA that has an Indian name. And you look at the name and you say, okay, this is an Indian name. And you look at a picture of him and you say, okay, it's an Indian guy. I went to meet him And I said, oh, hi, how you doing? And then he answered me, hola Solange, mucho gusto en conocerte, in perfect Spanish. And I thought, okay, even I got tricked there. And he said, mother from Argentina, father from India. He's an American, like all of us are. And I think that if we are a little bit more sensitive to that, if we are willing to talk about that a little bit more, I think a lot of some of these problems get, resolved.
Right. Before we keep the conversation going, because I want to do that, I want to stop for a second and give the CLA code, which is DIV 914. That's DIV 914. It's there on your screen. Okay. Erica and Pam, I think you each wanted to say something.
Well, I mean, I'll just say something about LGBTQ inclusion. For us, that's really, really important. And, I feel so blessed. And, I want to thank Kelly because she's, been such an important person in just our firm even existing and, me having the ability to do what I do. And it's, absolutely, so Monique and I are so grateful that, we obviously, have a focus on female founders and minority founders, but, we've seen a lot of, non-gender conforming or non-hetero female founders coming to us and feeling so comfortable and so excited and really empowered and eager to work with a firm like ours. And, when I kind of really step back and think about it, it's, you can really appreciate probably the hesitation and awkwardness with which they probably, would normally be approaching some of these more traditional bro firms. So, for us, we've seen a great amount of deal flow, from that sort of, diversity angle. And, we're really here to serve them. And, I certainly hope that more and more firms like ours, come onto the scene that can really make, every type of folk, feel included, feel seen, and feel empowered. So, I absolutely love that you brought that up. I mean, it's not even something I think that I was really thinking about, when we first, it was said, underrepresented founders, but, I from experience, I've seen such impact there. And so, we're grateful to serve that community.
And I just simply wanted to add, one of the things that, the SEC recently approved NASDAQ proposed rule around diversity. And I was pleased to see the shout out to the LGBTQ community in that. So it's not just gender, ethnicity, but it also includes LGBTQ. I'm hoping, I know I approach diversity from all aspects because I think it makes me sad to think that some groups are not included in people's decision-making authority. So I'm hopeful that as we move forward around this diversity, particularly in the financial services industry, we begin to bring also to the forefront individuals with disabilities. We just don't think enough about these individuals, and we don't cite to them like we do gender and ethnicity. So that's my hope. But I think the NASDAQ rule is a start in terms of publicly including it as a category to collect information around.
I think that's a really important point. One of the questions that has been posed, and maybe we have time for one more question before you sign off. An observation that seems like there's been a lot of success in having more diversity in people holding the CIO roles, particularly women, but maybe less success in money going to diverse investment managers and diverse asset managers. I will share with you all something that one of my very dear friends who was a CIO at one of my largest clients shared with me, which was that women often take the roles at the public pension plans because they pay less. And the men don't necessarily want those roles. They go into private asset management. But that being said, they have a lot of power. And you know, it's important to see how that power is wielded. I think Solange did a really good job of explaining the impact that a CIO can have. But you know, would you all say that that's a fair observation, that there are more diverse people in CIO roles, but that's not necessarily translating in dollars going to managers that are more diverse? Solange?
Well, I think there are a lot of analogies out there that relate to that. Women are more teachers, women are more in the public sector, women are more in. So I think that where does that get us, though, is what I want to know. Like, where does that get us by pointing that out? If we have free will to make the choices that we make.
Yeah.
Because I think that it's an evolution. You know, when I look at Erica and I listen to Erica talk, and I listen to the SEC venture capitalists and women and minorities raising money, that wasn't around when I was coming through school and thinking about my career. So I think some legacy things still exist, is my point. And we will make it through these legacy things if we keep just pushing for more inclusion and diversity. That's my final thought, is that these are just traditional things that still a residual of baby boomers being in the workplace. But as we move forward, we'll have more VCs like Erica.
I hope so. And let me tell you, I want to be paid just as much, if not more than that.
Yeah, really.
So, we're working
And
hard.
guess what? When you're the boss lady, you get to make that decision. So,
Exactly.
There you go.
That's
we
right.
just want to encourage more Ericas and Moniques to go out there and start their firms. Well, with
So,
that,
Kelly,
go ahead,
I'm
Solange.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Your question was basically that even though we have more women as CIOs, we do not see that translate to more diversity in actual managers. Was that the question?
I think that was the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's sad, quite honestly, but I would love if more women went for the CIO position, because it's more than just the investors. It's more than just the partners that you choose. It's basically, you know, through corporate governance, you can do an incredible job with firms. You can, especially if you're a large investor, if you're a large investor like CalSTRS, CalPERS, New York Common, New York City, when they call and they say, Mr. President, we want you to change your firm in this area or we're going to divest. That carries an incredible, powerful message. And you can see that happening more and more. So the CIO has an incredible amount of power. I wish there were more people that came to that position and really understood, you know, what is entailed. And
yeah, we're all about having more women in positions of power from an allocation.
More, and how about more veteran women? You know, the most
veteran women,
group,
sure.
most ignored group ever. You know.
All right, I think we have lots of topics for other panels. I'm very excited about that. I want to thank everybody: Solange, Erica, Pam, Jesse. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you to everyone who attended today.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.